Welcome. Simon Jacobson. In the Hasidic lingo, we even say Good Yom Tov today, because it's the 19th of Kislev, which 216 years ago was the liberation of the Baal HaTanya and Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement. He was liberated from prison, which was considered more than just an event, a personal event, but actually a vindication and an opening, like a permission that what he was doing was correct in spreading and teaching Hasidic thought. We'll talk about that. So, Good Yom Tov, and we say something called the Rosh Hashanah of Hasidus, because with this event began a revolution, a new era, era and stage in both in divine revelation as well as in transformation of this world through Torah and through Yiddishkeit and through the God's plan. So hence we title this class, special title, The Psycho-Spiritual Revolution of Our Times. And it's dedicated in honor and memory, and loving memory of Malka Bas Chana, whose Yortzeit is the 17th of Kislev, and may the teachings here serve her well and serve her family well. And whenever you teach in the memory of a soul, that the Shama is with us, even though we don't see the soul is sees us, because we can't really see behind the curtain. And therefore, all the teachings that we do in the honor of the soul, besides giving joy and pleasure to the soul, it also empowers all those connected to that soul, and by extension, all of us. What I've heard of her is that she was a real Malka, a real queen, a revolutionary in her own right from Kansas City, a leader in that community. So it's fitting to talk about revolution. Now, we look around today. Maybe we take it for granted, but it's pretty clear that we're in the midst of a global revolution ourselves. It's not in history. You have rare, if at all, a concentration of so many developing technologies all happening at the same time. Throughout history, things happened, but it took years, and we literally are living through experience now that. Basically, in every field, in every arena, we're experiencing true revolution. Whatever you touch, let's take medicine. To measure it, let's just measure longevity, life expectancy. In 1920, basically 100 years ago, life expectancy was, I believe, 31 years old. And now it's 67 years old. I'm not getting now the quality of life, spiritual life, but that tells you what was achieved in those 100 years. Take communications, science, all the technologies that are at our fingertips, the access to information. Everything's changed, even in our lifetimes. 20 years ago, 30 years ago for sure, we didn't have access to information. You needed people to tell you this piece. Today it's almost the opposite. You have access to all information, you just can't sift through what is garbage, what isn't. You almost need people to tell you what's not information. There's a website I think called uselessinformation.com. It's a very interesting website. Very interesting stuff, but it's useless. It basically has no, there's no real. So we live in a world where they say you can get anything, anytime, anywhere. So it's really, it's unbelievable in many ways, at your fingertips. And we also see with our own eyes the doubling and the tripling and the acceleration, and there's no end in sight. So it's a truly revolutionary life and times in the generation we're living in. And even on that's on the technology and science, medical front. Take into consideration, and remember, and then there's the exponential effect. When all this comes together and everybody has access, so everything speeds up even more, because people can contribute and know what's quicker. Once upon a time, 100 years ago, it could take a lifetime to find out about an innovation that happened on the other end of the earth. Definitely a few hundred years ago. And today, so everything. So we don't even know what that mass exponential mass effect, the critical mass, how it will be changed as everything continues to accelerate and continues to reach people quickly, and for good or for bad, for that matter. I personally see, especially in my work, that there's a certain collective misery that has become accelerated because everybody knows about everyone else's problems today in a far more immediate way, whether it's through social media or other networks and so on. And then, if you really want to broaden it, even in the political arena, despite our challenges, and we know we're dealing with a very big upheaval and unknown in the Middle East, with all that's happening, and Israel right in the middle of things. But we have to also be honest in saying that it's never been as peaceful time as it is today. I looked at some statistics. Since World War II, there's never been a time in history that there's been so little wars. So the 20th century up till 1945 was the most bloodiest century. But from 1945 and on, if you look at all the graphs, the wars have gone down radically. So that doesn't mean there aren't any. But that type of global wars, that besides World War I, World War II, you take about the 100-Year War, the Franco-Russian War. I mean, history was all about wars. And essentially, since 1945, there hasn't been really a global war. Thank God. And even the more localized ones are, it always looks stronger when you're living in it. But if you look at the bottom line is, I wasn't around in World War II. But you're talking about 110 million people dying in World War I and World War II. That's a big number. So another measure of progress is the measure of freedom. I believe that they're saying today that out of the 192 countries that they call countries in the world, is down to, I think, 32 that are considered unfree. It's still too much, but it's a big difference. And what means unfree? For example, for Jews, the Soviet Union until 1990 was a large prison. Today it's not. Whatever your opinion of Putin is, but for the Jewish people and basically traveling and other options, there's many, it's opened up. And I'm not trying to be naive and optimistic in suggesting that there aren't challenges. But if you look at the big picture, freedoms that we have today are unprecedented. For Jews we were always what they call the miner's canary, where we were the antenna that picked up immediately whenever there was evil in the world. We were the first ones that were the victims. So look, we can go and do anything we want Jewishly, anywhere in the world without any resistance. I'm not suggesting there isn't anti-Semitism and there isn't a resurgence of it in some extent, but it's on an individualistic level. You don't have, for example, a country like ours, someone discriminates against you as a Jew, you can prosecute. You don't have institutionalized anti-Semitism is almost non-existent, except in countries where there are no Jews anymore, like, for example, let's say some of the Muslim countries. And again, I'm not trying to minimize. I know you'll say it's so counterintuitive to all the news we're hearing the last weeks and months, ISIS, Hamas, the call for Israel's destruction. I didn't say that the world is a perfect world. I'm just saying overall, we are living in free times. So when you look at it all from the bird's eye view, and that's what I'm suggesting, the bird's eye view, looking at the whole history, it's revolutionary times however you twist it. That does not discussing now on a personal level. There's perhaps more a personal crisis of intimacy and relationships and love maybe than ever in history as well, which is an interesting paradox. That on one hand we have such comforts and we have so much advancements, on the other hand there's such a deterioration of the family structure, of loyalty on a personal level, so much corruption in a certain way. But if you notice, the interesting thing is the deterioration is within, not so much without. It's not like, when I say without, obviously corruption affects you also without, but I mean to say, we are our own worst enemy. Nobody's forcing somebody to be immoral. Nobody's forcing, that's something you yourself do. Whereas if you turn the clock back 100, 200, 300 years ago, you were talking about institutionalized crime. You're talking about monarchs, the church, despots. They were talking about fascists, people who were in control of other people's lives. Today, the enemy is within. As I've often discussed, the enemy is apathy, the war against apathy. So, in this context, especially when you're a thinking person, we all know things don't happen by accident. If a volcano erupts, you can rest assured that there are forces beneath the surface that have been accumulating and building up, and that's why it's erupting. Same with an earthquake. Same with a boiling kettle. So when events happen that are seemingly like explode on the scene, and has been noted almost to a point of some call it even miraculous, that from the Industrial Revolution and on, which was 1840, considered the Industrial Revolution, things have, in a period of 100, 150 years, more advancements and more innovations than the previous 2,000 years. And no one really has an explanation how to understand why. Now, usually, innovation happens in a, what do we call it, in a, not sporadic, progressive or segmented or in a slow pace. Every few years, some innovation. In the 19th century, and definitely now, suddenly there was a surge of more innovation that transformed the world. You've heard of Admiral Adam Rickover. Admiral Rickover is a Jewish admiral. He was the highest-ranking admiral, 4-star general. Navy. He's considered the father of the nuclear navy. They call him. He was an immigrant from Europe, I think, from Poland. Was it before World War II? But he came to the United States. In 1955, he delivered a landmark talk for the government, for the Pentagon, I think, and shared a statistic which is really quite mind-blowing to understand the change and shift in history. The statistic he shared was that in 1855 to 1955, here's the change. Energy produced in the world, in 1855, 95% of that energy was man-made, was human-generated, which means human beings working in fields, human beings working on machines, and so on. It was human labor that generated 95% of energy was generated by human labor. And in 1955, in 100 years, 92% of energy is generated by machines, which, if you think about it, really explains why wealth and so much and leisure and free time literally exploded in that 100 years. Because when you're spending, for example, 8 hours a day laboring in a field to yield a few potatoes or grain or something else in order to eat, and then sell maybe the little remains surplus to someone else, you really don't have time for anything else. But now if you press a button and you have the car, the turbine, or the steam engine, or the other different technologies, so with that one hour, 8 hours of labor, you can produce maybe the same results, yield 6 months that would take human labor to do. So what happened to human energy? Where did it go? And that's where they had more time and more energy to apply their minds to develop new vehicles, financial vehicles. You'll see the whole world of finance, as we know, modern finance, happened in the last 100 years. Not that banking began the last 100 years, but the ability to use to rely on machines where you can just, like today, look, it keeps on happening even in our times. How much time do we have to invest now to turn on the lights in our house, or to keep the thermostat, or to keep the temperature? You set a thermostat. I'm just using small examples. Basically, it's all memorized, memorized transactions, so to speak. Right? So the question really is, what happened all this time? What happened to us? Well, a lot of bad things happened too. With all this leisure, we became a very empty-souled people, because when you have a lot of free time in your hands and you don't have what to do with it, what happens? There was no time to be a drug addict in 1855. Even if you could get some drugs here and there, you had no leisure. You didn't have that type of boredom of saying, what am I going to do today? You had plenty to do, because if you didn't do it, you wouldn't live. Survival was the single most important thing. Of course, on the blessing side of it, all this time, if you use it for good things, you can achieve unbelievable achievements because you don't have to spend so much time sweating. Just to give you a little taste of the changes. And frankly, it's very important to know this, and any student of history knows this. You never can really understand the time we live in while we're living in it, because it goes so slowly and we're on the ground level. Imagine trying to understand the big picture when you're standing on the ground. You have to climb up on the mountain. In the context of time, that means you have to have a bird's eye view and look back over 100 years, over 200 years. Chow En-lai famously said to the Western reporters when Nixon first went to China, in 1971, 72, 71. So, when China first opened up a completely closed economy, a closed country, after Mao Zedong, who was the Lord, died. So the Westerners were the first time they had an opportunity to actually interview the Chinese. So they asked Chiang Mai, the prime minister, they said, so what's your opinion about the French and American revolutions? And what he answered was classic. He said, it's too early to tell. Because China is a culture of 1,500 years, 1,800 years, and American-French revolutions are just a few hundred years, you know. Or I think Gandhi said, they asked him about Western civilization, he said, it's a nice idea, you know. Because when you're dealing with seniority, now, I don't know if you know this, but I hear this from people who deal with business, do business with Chinese. Chinese don't respect anyone except Jews. Not necessarily because they're Jewish, but because of their longevity. They're the only nation and culture older than they are. And anyone that's practical and pragmatic, you always trust something that withstood the test of time, which is the basis in business. You know, if you see a business that's been around for 3,800 years, they must be doing something right. The Dalai Lama, anyone who goes visits him that's Jewish, the first question he asks is, how did you guys make it without a country for so many years, without an empire, without armies, without wealth, literally being persecuted? Because it's the biggest mystery of history, is the Jewish people's perseverance, and not just perseverance, growth, the ability for them to thrive. That after World War II with the Holocaust, that we should be here sitting, and a Renaissance in Israel, the United States, and so on. So as I said, I'm not ignoring the challenges of our times. We have many of them. But you have to also count your blessings, and you have to appreciate and not take for granted so much that we have. My father used to tell me about the fear he grew up with in the Soviet Union, Stalin, who not just was fearful, it was his policy to drive fear in everyone. All levels, the whole hierarchy of his government, of leadership, all the way down to the simple peasant in the former Soviet Union, was driven by fear. Can you imagine waking up with fear, going to sleep with fear, never knowing who's going to be arrested, never knowing who's loyal, who's not loyal? They destroyed even the family unit where usually at least you can rely on your parents, your brothers and sisters. They destroyed even that. They tortured and had people start informing on their own family members. Imagine a life where you don't know who's your friend and who's your enemy. You know, even as my father would tell me the stories, it was hard for me to emotionally experience, because it's so different. We don't have that. You go to sleep, you know. Today, again, our enemies are within. Unfortunately, there are plenty of challenges that are taking place in homes, holocausts, abuse, dysfunctionality, abandonment, and all other worse in our own homes. But that's brought on people. That's not some outside enemy doing it. So, which is, of course, again, just to emphasize the tragedy of that. That's under our control. So with all this said, you have to what are the forces at work that brought this so-called volcano, positive one, these eruptions of change, of paradigm shifts and radical change happening literally in every segment of society. And I should qualify before I continue, when I say a paradigm shift doesn't always mean we use it right, and doesn't always mean it serves good ends. It could also become commercialized and corrupt. And, you know, like today with the press of, they say junk in, junk out. So technology, with all its benefits, could also become a major force of disaster, as you see how it's affecting personal relationships and so on and so forth. So I'm not suggesting this is all a blessing, but again, it's a blessing, and it's we who have the choice to use it as a blessing, or as the Torah says, or God forbid, the opposite of a blessing. So these eruptions are not by accident. Jews have always emphasized, especially the Jewish mystics, that history is like footprints in the sand. And you have to look for those footprints to really appreciate how things emerge. And to really understand things, you have to have the context. So to put it in a Torah context, and context especially of tonight's Yutes Kislev, and tomorrow, this day, that I call the psycho-spiritual revolution, the true revolution really began with Abraham, and then at Sinai with Moses. But to understand their role, and then ultimately how history unfolded, in that context, let's go back all the way to the beginning. The Garden of Eden. Yeah, the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden, where there were the two trees, the tree of life, among many trees, but the two prominent trees that the Bible describes, the Torah describes, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. It's interesting. Life and knowledge. Knowledge of good and evil. And God says to Abraham, Adam and Eve, eat from the tree of life, but do not eat from the tree of knowledge. And if you do eat from it that day, you will then die. You will taste the taste of death, and then you'll ultimately die. And of course, everybody wonders what exactly is going on. And there are many interpretations. I'll try to explain it on a very personal level, because as we've discussed many times, these biblical stories are not just ancient historical narratives or metaphors or fairy tales. They're actually psychological drama playing itself out in our own lives. We all are placed in the Garden of Eden, and we all have two trees, and we all are given the choice. And everything that unfolds in the Bible unfolds in our own personal lives. And it tells us the real story of who we are. You know? So the paradise of the Garden of Eden is an example for everybody begins their lives. You begin in the Garden of Eden in a healthy environment. First you spend 9 months in your mother's womb, pretty much protected completely. And you don't have to do anything for that. And then if you grow up born, and I'm assuming a healthy home, it's a nurturing home, it's a garden. It's an environment that is nurturing, protective. At young age, children don't have their resources or the defenses and necessary, so healthy parents build a garden. You know, it's one of the most beautiful ways to describe a healthy home is a garden where the gardeners are the parents. And what do? They don't create anything, but they create an environment. What makes a healthy garden? Two things. You nurture, water, and cultivate and do what you have to do to allow the natural growth of the earth and the seeds that are planted to blossom. And the second thing you do is the opposite. Surmara. You weed the garden and make sure that negative influences don't contaminate and don't overwhelm and don't disturb the growth of the flowers. So if you think of it in terms of our own lives, that's exactly what a healthy home, a healthy family should be doing, parents. Number one, creating an environment of positivity, building confidence, reinforcement, validation, and all the cultivation, watering their children, watering them with love and with respect and encouragement and a positive attitude. And even when there's a challenge, you have the strength, infusing them with confidence, that they can achieve anything they set their minds to. And the second thing is a home is a protective place, which is a shelter from the elements, of course, and also from negative forces that are negative in the sense of psychologically negative, fearful, and so on. So a healthy child, you know, when people talk about healthy, their homes, their memories, again, I'm talking about a healthy home, obviously, because an unhealthy home is an unhealthy garden. And it's not even a garden. It could be a war zone. So the way it's meant to be, when people talk about their childhood and they smile and they have these memories, what do they remember? They remember that peaceful hearth, the coziness, the comforts, and so on. Now, I know many of us have not experienced that. And as a matter of fact, often when I describe it this way, some people tell me that you're making me cry because I was deprived of such a home. But I think it's still important to spell out, because we all have a second chance as we build our own families. We don't have to do it in the way, if we unfortunately were products or victims of someone else's mismanagement, to put it mildly. So nevertheless, so we're all born in a garden as Adam and Eve. So essentially the beginning of the story of the Bible is the beginning of our story. Now, in the garden, as I said, there's two things. There's things you do, the things you don't do. You eat from certain trees, and from certain trees you don't eat. Like in this case, where you do the right things that make the flowers blossom, that's called the positive actions you do. And then there's avoiding the negative, the weeds. In this case, the tree of knowledge represented a knowledge of good and evil. You don't have to taste from it. It's enough to learn that there's good and evil. Oh, you want to preserve. You don't want a child to lose their innocence too early. As a matter of fact, you never want them to lose their innocence. But if they're going to lose it, might as well lose it a lot later in life than earlier in life. So you protect them in that way. And that way they have these two trees. But what happens the first time a child does eat from the forbidden fruit? And this can mean any type. This can be the first time a child lies, the first time a child hurts somebody else, the first time a child is destructive. It doesn't only mean in a sexual sense, even though in many of the books they talk about the tree of knowledge as in the Torah calls it sexuality, intimacy, knowledge. So it definitely has that element of it. That's why afterwards it says that Adam and Eve were ashamed of their nakedness, because suddenly what happened? They became aware of themselves. Up till that point they were like newborn children. Newborn children are not conscious of their sexuality. Why? Because it's part of who they are. Nothing wrong with it. When do we become so-called embarrassed? Is when we suddenly realize that that because we suddenly realize we're a consciousness that is separate from the divine consciousness. And as such, we become somewhat disconnected. It's a dissonance. So the tree of knowledge, the eating of the tree of knowledge is the first dissonance, which ultimately can lead to duplicity and all the other forces that ultimately shape us as we become older and mature, and we lose that seamlessness and innocence and purity that a child has. And then what happens? You're banished from the garden. Not because of punishment, it's cause and effect. Once you don't have that purity, you're no longer in the garden. Now you've tasted from it, so now you've become part of the problem, not part of the solution. So you're no longer in this pure garden. Now you're thrust into a challenging world. And here you have to already earn your own way. There's pain. That's what Adam, it says from here on, you will earn, with the sweat of your brow you will eat bread. And Eve is told, now you'll have birth pains and pains of bringing up children. Now you have to begin the struggle. In a different way of putting it, a different way that sometimes the mystics, the Kabbalists, the Hasidic masters put it is that it's ultimately the challenge of the battle between matter and spirit, matter and energy. That in a seamless world, the body and soul, or you could say materialism and spirituality, are part of one seamless whole. Everything is great. You may have heard the word klipa. Klipa is a Hebrew word used often in Hasidic terminology or in Kabbalistic terminology for evil. But in truth, klipa doesn't mean evil. Klipa means shell, a husk. A klipa is the shell of like a nutshell, an eggshell, a potato peel, or orange peel. These are called klipot. Why do we use the word klipa when we talk about the negative? Because when things are healthy, a healthy fruit, is you have a fruit and you have a peel. Why do you have a peel or a shell? In order to protect the fruit from insects, from infection, from bacteria, from whatever it is, worms. So when everyone knows here's the fruit and here's the shell, everything is good. But as the Shalor writes, and the Baal Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, was called a Shaloid, because a lot of what he wrote was a teacher, what he taught was based on the Shalor. Shalor writes an interesting thing. That at the beginning of creation, the Klippa was Shemer Lepri. The husk protected the fruit. And everyone knew that. So that's fine. The material world is essentially, basically a shell that's protecting the divine fruit within. When you're aware of that, you don't get seduced by the peel. You don't get seduced by material power and money and all that materialism represents. And you see the material world as simply a shell, a glove, to reveal the hand within. But what happens if you forget there's a hand within the glove? What happens if you forget there's a fruit inside the peel? And you start worshiping the peel. You start dancing on the potato peel instead of realizing there's a potato inside. Here's the distortions. You're suddenly worshiping the peel, which is only meant to be a shell for something within. Then that's called klipa. That means that the divine fruit is concealed, and now instead of the means being the means have become an end. And look at our lives. What do you do most of the day? You're involved in a material world, the pursuit of money, the pursuit of influence, the pursuit of with all the reasoning behind it, because without it we can't survive. But when does and is it a means or an end? Well, the means ends up becoming an end because you get so involved in it, you forget there is an end. And many people, at some point in life, say to themselves, okay, I'm making money, I'm working hard, to what end? So most people will say, well, I'll make enough money, and then I'll retire and be able to do the end. But by that time, they don't even, Or I'll make enough money, then I'll be able to spend time with my children. And who's spending time with them right now, while you're busy with what? I don't think I have to elaborate how the material world completely seduces us and distracts us. So this is the typical story of a klipa, of a shell that has taken control, and the fruit is barely there. Or we're barely aware of it, I should say. A soulful person sees life like this way. A soul, that we're a spiritual experience, we're a spiritual entity, spiritual entities on a physical journey. And physical human beings see ourselves like this. We're physical people on a spiritual journey. In truth, this is the soul's journey to earth with a very particular purpose, to transform the world, to go in the world that's outside of the garden, and create a garden once again. God says, come into my garden. Then the beginning of creation, everything was a garden. But then through man's sin, and you know what the word for sin is, by the way? In Hebrew, avera. Avera means displacement. Avera means to move away from something. Mitzvah means to connect. So think about it for a moment. All dissonance relates to avera, and all connection relates to mitzvah. Most people say mitzvah is commandment and avera is a sin. What do those weird words mean even? What do commandment and sin mean? They're very simplistic. It's like saying, okay, God commands and God says, do this, don't do that. But when you think of it in terms of connection, it's very intriguing. What is it connecting me to? It's connecting the fruit to the peel. It's connecting matter to energy. And it's connecting you, what you do, with who you are. Today you ask most people, who are you? They give you their business card. But that's not who you are, that's what you do. As a matter of fact, if someone asks you who you are, that's not an easy question to answer. Can you answer that quickly? Elevator pitch, who am I? You're a soul that was sent to this earth with a very unique and indispensable mission that you and only you can accomplish. And until you don't discover that mission, you're dealing with the means, with the klippah, with the shell, and not with the fruit. The fruit is the purpose of your life. Why were you sent here? You're not sent here to survive and to pay your bills. Because that, if you weren't sent here, it would have been fine too without that. You're sent here to achieve something, to bring light into a dark world. So the garden is there, and then when the first displacement, which displaces them from the garden, is the first dissonance where we wander away from who we really are. Our ideals, our values, our soul. And the rest of life is catching up and trying to reconnect to the child within, to the fruit within, to the garden. See, all the analogies, metaphors, garden related. And that's what happens. It says that Adam and Eve, the first sin, so the Shekhinah disconnected from earth. The next generation of sin, disconnected at the second level of disconnection. All the way till the flood, the seventh generation, the disconnected, like that the Shekhinah went up, so to speak, to the seventh heaven, which really means the 7 levels of separation or disconnect. And then who came and reversed it? Abraham, first revolutionary and pioneer. Took a world that became so overridden by weeds that had to be destroyed in the flood, and he finally began to reverse the process. And it says Abraham took from the 7th level of disconnect and turned it to 6th level. Isaac 6 to 5. Jacob 5 to 4. Levi, Jacob's children 4 to 3. And then Kahos 3 to 2. And then finally Amram 2 to 1. And Moses took from 1 to the 7th generation from Abraham and brought it back to the same state as it was in the Garden of Eden. And that's where it says he received the Torah at Sinai, the reconnection of matter and spirit, that the divine, like the Medrash says, that which was above came down below, and that which was below rised above. The fusion, thousands of years before Einstein would formulate it into E equals mc squared, Sinai was the first E equals mc squared. Matter and energy were reunited. The klippah, the glove and the hand were reconnected. The fruit and the shell were fused as one. And then he brought it down, v'shachanti b'seichem, he built a temple of physical materials, of gold, silver, copper, which were the cause of so much idolatry and worship and distraction, a golden calf. He turned it all into a mishkan, a sanctuary for the divine, building a garden, a home for God in this world. And the rest of history is all about this. Because Moses and his generation gave us the power. And then began the long journey. Can we transform the world into that type of selfless, divine place? Or will we continue to be seduced by the tree of knowledge, good and evil, selfishness, and self-interest becomes the driving force instead of God-centric, egocentric life. And history is witness and testimony to these battles, the battles between matter and spirit, both on a spiritual level, on a psychological level, and also on a physical level. What in essence is science and technology? If you're able to get it into one word, it's unity. That this way you look at a world that's fragmented, compartmentalized, thousands, millions, billions, and trillions of cells and systems and organisms, and science finds laws and rules of nature that make sense of it all. It's not made up of billions of fragments, it's made up of one unit. That's why they keep looking for the unified field theory, that one law that will connect all the laws. So they got it down to the four forces. That electromagnetism, gravity, the strong force and the weak force, nuclear force. But ultimately that unity is what seeks, because science does is it finds a rule, it finds a law, through study, through experimentation, through replication, that now this law, now we can make sense of something. So it's really, essentially it's a unifying force of trying to understand the unifying forces that connect the fragments of this universe. All science is about that. From mathematics to physics, to medicine, and so on. That we're not just a whole bunch of different pieces. And as such, essentially the search for the unity that the scientists are searching is the same search for unity that Moses and Abraham brought into a fragmented world. What is unity? When you look at a fruit and its shell, and you don't know this is the shell for this fruit, you have fragmentation. When you're working at home, or working all day, and you come home, and you're exhausted, and you cannot balance your home life and your work life, you have fragmentation. Unity is finding the deeper force and saying, you know what, your work is a shell, is a means to a higher end. So the idea of finding fusion, finding unity, is essentially across the board. It's not just a scientific idea, it's a spiritual idea. And that's the commonality between all knowledge. What is knowledge? Taking many different things that seem disconnected and finding their commonality and finding something that connects them all. What is the greatest prayer in Jewish liturgy? Shema Yisrael. What's the last word? Hashem Echad. Which means not just there's one God, monotheism, and not many gods. It means there's one reality and not many realities. So imagine if you were able to find a common denominator between everything you do through your day and through your life. What kind of peace of mind that would be. Right now we're torn in all different directions. Expectations, demands from family, from work, from workers, from employees, the pressures from all over. A person of peace, of inner peace, finds that hub and finds that common thread that connects it all and realizes it's all part of God's bigger plan. And these are just pieces, spokes, that are connected by one hub. This is essentially the ultimate spiritual person. And this essentially is also the best scientist. So when you see changes happening throughout history, it's all about seeking that unity. Now that unity takes place is not just, the scientist will find the unity in the phenomenon and the natures of the laws of nature. And the spiritualist will find the unity also in personal behavior. Just to give you an example. Bertrand Russell was once behaved in a very unethical way in Cambridge, and the ethics committee called him in. He was doing inappropriate things with some of his students, not very uncommon. And they called him in and they said, "You teach ethics. You're not. So how is it consistent with your behavior?" So he says, "I also teach mathematics, and I'm not a triangle," which is the classic academic statement that you are not what you teach, and you're not and what you teach is not who you are. You're the objective scientist that's studying phenomenon from like behind the glass, and has nothing to do with you. You can be brilliant in dissecting every aspect of it, but you can be a lowlife. Let's contrast that with Maimonides, who says that if you want to know who's a wise person, he says, who's the chacham, who's the wise person? You don't look at his oratory skills or his brilliance or exposition and his logic and rationale. You look at something completely counterintuitive, how he walks and talks and eats and sleeps and treats people, the details of his actions. You could say, what does one thing have to do with the next? He could be brilliant, because you see in Judaism, unity means that what you teach is who you are, and who you are is what you teach. That doesn't mean we're perfect human beings, but to glorify and deify this compartmentalization is ridiculous. we should be aspiring to that type of unity. We could say, I'm not there yet. But to say, hey, no problem, that's the problem. I remember the Rebbe once said at Fabrein, something really always remained with me. He said, everybody has flaws, but don't make a philosophy out of your flaws. Because then it becomes hopeless. Because now it's a philosophy, it's a whole way of thinking. And the next generation comes, now you have to contend with, it's a new philosophy that, at least be honest enough and humble enough to know, that's a mistake, I'm accountable. Why is this so critical? Because in Jewish thought, it was never enough just to find a scientific theory that would connect all phenomenon. It was also important to connect it to our beings. In other words, psychological symmetry was just as important as philosophical symmetry. And this is the story of history. The conflict between self-interest and higher purpose, the conflict between the shell and the fruit, between matter and spirit, between form and function, between body and soul, between materialism and spirituality. And I can give you another 100 synonyms. You could fill in the blanks yourselves. That's the story of life, both of individual life and all of history. And as history rolled on, the world did become a more refined place. And as I said earlier, today we are beneficiaries of thousands of years of work in this direction of joining these two together. It started with Abraham, started in the garden, but then it went downhill, but then uphill with Abraham, Moses, and it continued to grow and it continued to spread. Today, the ideas of civil rights, for example, that we are all created equal, that we all have an inalienable rights, is only a few hundred years old, institutionalized by the Declaration of Independence. But it's always the basis of entire Jewish thought, which is every human being was created in the divine image, and we're all fruits in the garden, and everybody's entitled to reach the highest levels of that type of fusion and unity. So as the years rolled on, it's not an accident that suddenly began to erupt. Because it's not suddenly. Thousands of years of work and a recognition of finding that type of inner unity ultimately began to take hold. And as human beings became more humane to each other, technology and science developed. Everyone recognizes that the Enlightenment that began to challenge the authority, the absolute dictatorial authority. Whatever, you get the idea. Dictatorial authority of the monarchs of the church was directly linked to free inquiry and open thought, open-mindedness. Why? Because as soon as you're able to think not how someone else is telling you to think, you start creating a climate of unifying forces. Now, many have pointed out that enlightenment went too strong. The other way, they became so selfish in their own pursuits that they denied the gifts and the humility necessary to recognize there is a God. But they rebelled, as Nietzsche said, God is dead, because that's a God that was never alive in the first place. But as the joke goes, Nietzsche said God is dead, and God said Nietzsche is dead. So you have to wonder who gets the last laugh, But the point being that in the last few centuries, with the changes, the great changes that took place, one of the key elements of it was the understanding of a certain unifying forces at work. And that is what was the essence of scientific knowledge. And as the Zohar says, and this is the interesting thing, the Zohar, chapter Noach, it talks about, it says that in the year, it's a prediction. A Zohar that was written almost 2,000 years ago predicts that in the Hebrew year Tov Kuf, 5,600, 5,000 Tov Resh, I should say, 5,600, which is exactly 1840. There'll be an explosion of knowledge, as the Zohar puts it, based on a verse in Genesis where it talks about the flood, that the 6,000th in the 600th year there would be the heavens above and below would open up, rain. So the Zohar says there'll be an explosion, an eruption of higher knowledge and lower knowledge. As all the commentaries explain, it's essentially Torah knowledge and scientific knowledge. Why? Because as the thousands of years rolled on in history, and matter and spirit and form and function and the shell and the fruit, as I described earlier, became more closer to each other, then of course it readies the world and prepares it for this type of an eruption. So it's not a surprise that all these things took place. 1840 is the year that the Industrial Revolution is recognized to have taken hold. And since then, things have only accelerated. It's not gone down. Nothing today compared to 1840 is primitive compared to what we have today. But what happened was a fragmented world became a global village. Today we understand that the forces of unity are far more dominant than the forces that separate. We still haven't mastered it on a personal level, but on a scientific, technological, and communication level, every science recognizes this. More and more so. What are the forces that we talk about today? We don't talk about limbs and organs. You talk about DNA, cellular structure, the forces that connect stem cells. In science, you don't talk no longer about objects, even not about elements, not even about molecules. It's about subatomic particles. Subatomic particles that are similar throughout all of existence. If you're familiar with some quantum mechanics, string theory, it's all about a field of energy that connects everything's like on one unifying quilt. And the world that we see as being fragments, some call it even an illusion. It's not an actual illusion from a Torah point of view. The illusion is that it's really separate. Nothing is separate. There's no such thing as separation anymore. Everything is connected. The only thing is we're not aware of it or we don't sense it. But if you study science, that's what the whole meaning of science is, to find the connecting strings and the connecting glue that unifies everything around us. All going back to Hashem Echad. So in going back to the Garden of Eden, there was Achdus, there was a unity as Adam and Eve walked in that garden, where they were completely seamlessly connected to what their purpose was. And as soon as they ate from that tree of knowledge, as Maimonides and others explain, they lost their innocence. What happened? A new consciousness was emerged. Not just divine consciousness, that I am a seamless ambassador, agent of light, but now I have my own agenda, I have my own interests. When they were in the Garden of Eden, before they ate from the tree, they were naked and they didn't know it. Not because they were naive, because they were like children, seamless. What's wrong with nakedness? Since when is nudity a bad thing? Why is sexuality something to be self-conscious about? But as soon as you become an entity on your own, you start becoming conscious of yourself. So it's consciousness that defines. Now there's a subject and an object. Children have that seamlessness. And as soon as they lost it, the fragmentation began. The opposite of Achdus, Pirud, separation. And the rest of history has been trying to correct that split, that schism. And Mount Sinai, Abraham began the process, as I mentioned, by reversing the fragmentation and turning it into finding the unifying forces that connect, ultimately God himself. Moses concluded it with 7th generation from Abraham, with the Mount Sinai, which the Medrash says, that which was above came below, and that which was below went up above, a fusion of matter and spirit. And then was unleashed a new force that we can take a material object in this world and make it into something spiritual. Exactly what Einstein said, that matter can become energy, and energy can become matter. And the temple, the Mishkan, embodied that by taking truma, kesef, zav, gold, silver, copper, and all the other 12, 15 materials, and turning it into a divine sanctuary, which is somewhat odd. God is not material. King Solomon later would say to God that Shamayim lo shamei Shamayim lo yichal kalucha. The heavens and the other heavens of heavens cannot contain you. Afki abayis hazeh, can this mortal, mere physical building contain you? And what God's answer is? He repeats the same verse. Read exactly your same verse. Instead of reading it like a question, read it like an answer. That heavens and heavens of heavens cannot contain me, but this house, this physical house, can contain me. Because I'm not bound by the heavens. I'm as close to heaven as I am to earth. I'm as close to earth as I am to heaven. And I choose to right now be bound in this building so I can be bound here. In other words, God is not more spiritual than he is material. Since when is God is beyond the spirit and the matter. Like the Ibn Gabbai, one of the great Kabbalists, writes in his classic work called Avodas HaKodesh. He says the power of the infinite is such that if you say that it's only infinite and cannot be finite, cannot manifest in the finite, then that alone makes it finite, because it's only infinite and not finite. So kashem sheyesh lekeiche bebilti b'gvul, he says, kach yesh lekeiche b'gvul. So the ultimate infinite is that infinite can manifest in the finite, which is the essence of Jewish thought, which distinguishes it from all other spiritual and mystical systems. In all spiritual mystical systems, there's a material world and there's a spiritual world. And in Judaism, there's material, spiritual, and there's divine, Kedusha. And that's neither matter or spirit. That's why a simple action like a mitzvah can connect to the highest spiritual levels, just like the greatest meditation in the highest spiritual worlds. And that's what the Mishkan, the temple, signified. When the temple was destroyed, that became symbolic in the synagogue, in the home, where we build our homes. As the Shalah says, that I will rest among you, within every one of you. Because the verse says, Osel Migdash, build for me a sanctuary, and then it should have said, I will rest in it. Why does it say B'Seicham, in you? Because the point is that we, our physical beings, are meant to be a temple, an ambassador, an agent, a channel of divine energy. So this is the story of history, and as in the last centuries, as the Zohar predicted, as matter and spirit did get closer, there was an explosion in science, and an explosion also in spirituality. And this brings me to this night, Yutas Kislev, the 19th of Kislev. So 216 years ago, Reb Shneir Zalman Liadi was arrested, informed upon by the anti-Hasidim called the Misnagdim. And they essentially felt that he was a threat to Judaism, etc., etc. So the informants informed the Tsar's people that he's a man that was supporting the enemies of Russia, of Tsarist Russia. Who was the enemy? The Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And what was their so-called, every sheker, every lie has some truth to it. It was based on the fact that he was sending money to Israel, because he was he had sent students to live in Israel. Israel was then a barren land. The only way they could survive is through charity, through money sent to them from the Jews living in Eastern Europe and Russia. So he was sending money to them. So in effect, he's essentially supporting the enemy of the Russians, because Israel was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. So he was arrested. He sat in prison for 53 days, which later corresponds to the 53 chapters of Tanya that he wrote. And so the whole story of his being in prison, etc., etc. The ministers saw what kind of catch they had. They saw he wasn't a simple man. Today we have all kinds of documentation, how his interrogation is all documented. And they actually had him write answers to their questions. So it's very interesting to see his answers written to the Russians in Russian, and then he wrote it in Hebrew, and then it was translated into Russian. Anyway, I'm not going to go to the whole story of Megillas Yutas Kislev, but I will say the following, that he ultimately was freed from prison, which was a miracle, because he didn't have exactly due process then. They didn't want you out of prison. You were not in prison. There was no lawyers or pressure or anything like that. But it was seen by Hasidim and by the Alter Rebbe himself and by his colleagues, especially Lev Yitzchak Barditchev, who was his colleague as well as later his Mechutin, wrote letters where they all saw it as a vindication that his path of teaching Hasidus and Torah was acceptable. Because that was the question. Because he began to develop a system of teaching mystical teachings in ways that everybody could understand. And this was always seen as a dangerous activity, because certain things have to be kept under wraps. It's like the inner secrets were not taught in the public. So his imprisonment and ultimately his liberation was seen as a challenge to that path, to that method, and as a vindication. And after that, as the Hasidic Rebbes, the Chabad Hasidic Rebbes put it became what they call the Rosh Hashanah of Hasidus. His freedom was a sign that not only was he doing the right thing, but then began a whole new era of teaching the mystical teachings of Kabbalah and Hasidus in ways that everybody could understand. I frankly will tell you, without any hesitation at all, I would not be sitting here, nor would I be who I am today, nor I would be teaching what I teach, were it not for Yutas Kislev. Because growing up as a young man, the yeshivas I went to, and looking for personal spiritual relevance in Judaism, not just mechanical Judaism and cultural Judaism that's done out of either guilt or responsibility or perpetuating whatever was taught to you, but to do it with vitality and a dynamic element of soul and feeling you own it and feeling that you're passionate and excited about it, is direct result of the Chassidus that I learned, which is direct result of what Reb Shneir Zalman taught, which would not have happened had this day not happened. So on a personal note, I have to acknowledge that since you're all sitting here, you are in effect celebrating with me this day. But I'm not saying that in a personal, selfish way, because you could say, okay, fine, that's my thing, and you give me all the, say we respect your personal epiphanies. But I will tell you that the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, who was, mind you, a scholar on all levels. He also wrote a Shulchan Aruch, so he wasn't just a mystic and a Kabbalist and a soul spiritualist. He was also a master, a great genius in Talmud and Halacha. That his teachings are revolutionary on every possible level. People talk about Freud as the father of modern psychology. Okay, I've read enough Freud to tell you that the man, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, puts Freud in his back pocket in sophistication of what psychology is about. And it's not Rabbi Shneur Zalman alone. He's coming with the thousands of years of Jewish history, of Judaism that understands the human psyche and the human soul. So what did Rabbi Shneur Zalman do? Briefly, in one sentence, he documented a comprehensive blueprint and spiritual map of the human psyche, of the human soul, and of the cosmos. You tell me if that's a valuable contribution or not. Which means being able to then navigate and understand what your soul looks like. So if you go to a doctor, you get an X-ray, a CAT scan, other scans to understand what makes you tick. But what makes your soul tick? Who's going to give you a CAT scan or X-ray of that? That's what the Tanya does. That's what the other teachings and writings and discourses that Rabbi Shneur Zalman. By the way, the Tanya, even though as fundamental as it is, it's only a tip of the iceberg of what he taught. There's hundreds and hundreds of pages of his discourses which really lay out much more the real map of what I call the psyche, soul, and so on. So that's why it's a psycho-spiritual revolution. Now, in Judaism, you should always know no one is a revolutionary. Everyone builds upon what came before them. When you open the Tanya, he says right on the front page, the Alter Rebbe himself, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, that he took it Mepis Sfarim and Mepis Seifrim, Kav Yochel. I added the Kav Yochel. Mepis Sfarim, it was taken from books and from writers and scribes. Why? Because in Judaism, there's no one comes. The idea of an original idea is actually scorned upon. Frankly, all knowledge scorns on real originality. You know the joke they tell about this guy who spent half his life writing his dissertation, and then he presents it finally to the group of wizards of the world, and for their so-called review and critique. They come back unanimously, they tell him, your paper, we studied it, we read it, we reviewed it, and everyone feels it's both good and original. So he breathed a big sigh of relief, feeling, wow, that's nice. His whole life, his life work is now undergone peer review, and they're so supportive. The guy said, don't get so excited. The problem is this: the part that's good is not original, and the part that's original is not good. So that's both good and original. So in the Jewish thought, there's a concept in the Talmud. It says, anything that a good student, a very dedicated student, is mechadish, innovates, was given to Moses at Sinai. So everyone asks the question, so why do you call it innovation? Then it shouldn't say lechadish. If it was given already, what's the big thing? So there's a story in the Talmud. Moses in heaven sees Rabbi Akiva teaching Talmud. Rabbi Akiva was the great scholar, Kula Libed Rabbi Akiva, the greatest Talmudic scholar of all. And he has a whole interesting story as well. Till his age 40, he didn't know anything. And he became the greatest scholar. When Moses heard him sing, he started crying, saying, why'd you give the Torah to me? You should have given it to Rabbi Akiva. Look at how he expounds on the Torah. Moses says to God. And God says to him, everything he's teaching is from you. So of course, what does this mean? Because wisdom is not about innovation. Wisdom is about certain inner truths that are there, and each generation discovers a resonating element of it that maybe a previous generation was not aware of, but it's nothing new. So it's both a chiddush and not a chiddush. It's like when someone says something to you and you say, hey, I heard that somewhere, and it resonates so deeply. That's far bigger than if someone says, I never heard that before. Because it means it's a truth that's always been there. Truth is not something that is created by human beings. Truth, by definition, means it's true because it's true. And now the question is, at what stage will you recognize that? Like a song. And you suddenly hear the song and it says, it touches me. Now the song may have touched somebody last year, or 2 years ago, or 20 years ago. But now it's touched you, and that's the chiddush, that's the innovation. So you can take the same song that someone else plays or sings, and you sing it in your way, same tune. But for you, it's a completely new experience. One person sings it one way, another way. That's what real truth is about. And this is, by the way, not just true with Torah, it's true with science. You'll hear all the scientists. Newton famously said that we're like midgets standing on the shoulders of giants. Just for the record, I don't know if he stole it, but it comes from Jewish sources that go hundreds of years before Newton. I know I'm pulling a lot of rank here, but that's how it is. We've been around. So it's hard to not plagiarize from Jewish sources, because almost everything that's been said was said somewhere in the Bible or Talmud. So the point is that wisdom is about accumulation, not about innovation. The innovation is that when someone really sees good wisdom, they'll say, well, how did this guy see it? That's how it is. He saw something that everybody was looking at, and you see those deeper truths. So one of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, his name was Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, he was sixth in line from the Alter Rebbe, whose liberation we were celebrating. So he visited Berlin. He was coming from Lubavitch, the city of Lubavitch in Russia, visiting Berlin. And there was a delegation of German rabbis, Orthodox German rabbis, that came to see him. Now, one of the oldest and strongest Orthodox Jewish communities was in Frankfurt and in German cities, going back over 1,000 years. So one of the German rabbis asked the Rebbe, they said, we don't have any Hasidus here. What do Hasidus come to contribute that we have a strong Jewish community? What do you have why is it so important when we survived without it? So they were sitting in a hotel lobby, and it was a beautiful lobby, and he asked them, what do you see when you look around? And they described the most prominent feature in the lobby was its big marble pillars, these massive, beautiful pillars. So they described what they saw. The Rebbe stood up, and they followed him, and he went over to one of the pillars and took a lamp from one of the tables and shined the lamp closely to the pillar. And he says, what do you see now? So they started describing the intricate flowers and ornaments and designs engraved in the marble. So why didn't you say that before? They said from a distance you only saw the pillars. And now when we look closely, you can see all the different designs and the beautiful architecture. So the Rebbe said that's what Chassidus came to contribute, nothing new. It simply shines a light on the fundamentals of Judaism that may have been forgotten due to the distance or from looking from afar. So when you learn Chassidus, and if you learn Torah well, Talmud well, you see it all resonates, and you see a dimension that you say, how come no one sees it? That was the Chiddush of the Alter Rebbe. He was able to see. It's all there. And when you learn it, you cannot just say it. You have to experience it to fully appreciate it. It's like, think of the difference when someone reads a verse in the Torah, and then someone else reads the same verse, but you feel the soul that they read it with. You immediately say, this comes alive. The same idea comes alive. So this is about the soul, that the Zohar puts it. There's the body of Judaism, there's the soul of Judaism. So I've been talking all evening here about the body and soul, matter and spirit, form and function. That's what Chassidus is. It's introducing or revealing, you can say, the soul. Now, it was always there. Leaders, the Jewish leaders from Moses and Abraham, no questions. Abraham was, they say, the author of the first Kabbalistic work, Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation. That Moses, the whole Mount Sinai was a mystical experience. I mean, if you just read the verses. So the Torah is filled with that type of references. So there's no question that soul was always part of Jewish life. I mean, what did they experience exactly at Sinai? It wasn't a physical experience. They say that they heard the sound, they heard the sights and saw the sounds. What is that? Today they call it synesthesia, a certain condition where certain artists are able to see sounds and hear sights. They actually see certain colors when they hear sounds. Synesthesia. I've written a lot about it. If you go to our website, meaningfullife.com, you'll find Just write synesthesia.
I have this song. Let's name that so I understand.
Yeah, okay. However, as the Torah says, these things were kept. It's like, for the reason for preserving integrity, and people should not abuse this knowledge, so-called the secrets of Torah, Soid Shabbater, the esoteric, mystical, the idea of spreading these well springs everywhere. And two reasons are given to the change, what happened over the generations. One, seemingly contradictory reasons, but actually they're the same. One is the darkness intensified, and one is you get closer to Mashiach's times where there'll be total fusion. So when darkness intensifies, you need more light, you need more strength. Because today, especially today, we see the high levels of assimilation. If you're just going to rely on mechanical halachic Judaism, there's a whole generation that can be lost because they will not relate to something that they're not grow up with. So the spiritual can help touch them. And even for those that did grow up with it, to have dynamic Judaism is a key to perpetuating it. That's that reason. And the second reason is, as I said, as the generations rolled on, that the world becomes more refined. And a world when Mashiach comes, it says that's when there'll be the revelation of all the inner secrets. So as you get closer, think of it like each of the millennia, it says, is like one of the days of the week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So what is this millennia we're in now? The 6th millennia in Jewish history, it's Erev Shabbos, it's Friday. And the mitzvah is that you taste from the foods of Shabbos on Friday afternoon. So the foods of Shabbos is the foods of Mashiach's times, where there'll be a total unity and fusion between matter and spirit. So the teachings of the inner Torah is the teachings of matter and spirit in the Torah, soul and body of the Torah. And Yutas Kislev is a critical juncture of this process. So this revolution is not just a Jewish revolution or a Hasidic one. It's directly connected to all the events that are going on in the world today. The idea of joining matter and spirit, which is, if you want to put it in, I know it sounds a little esoteric, but it's really the heart of every challenge in life. Whether it's a challenge between spouses, between parents and children, between your own inner struggles of a material life and survival and your transcendent needs, it all comes down to this battle. And this is essentially what the entire purpose of Hasidus and Pnimius HaTorah is to help us integrate our outer and our inner. That we should not just be to integrate who you are with what you do. When Adam ate from the tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve, so the story goes, the Bible tells that they both were, of course, mortified, and then they suddenly heard God appear. So Adam hides in shame. And God asks him the question, Ayeka, where are you? When the Baal Tanya was in prison, one of the ministers, who was a scholar, came to him to visit him. And he said to the Baal Tanya, I want to ask you, why did God ask him, where are you? Well, God didn't know where he was. So the Alter Rebbe gave him Rashi's answer. The minister who knew his stuff said to him, I know Rashi's answer, I want to know your answer. So the story goes that the Alter Rebbe stood up, he was a tall, formidable person, and he stood up and looked at him. You hear this often in marital counseling. Where are you? Where's your mind? Where's your heart? I don't feel you with me. And what is this? This is like a good marital session? Huh? A good group therapy? Huh? I'm not going to ask you who has the problem with this, but anyway, so where are you? Ayeka. Look, you're sitting in the front row. You're going to be the brunt of the, specimen A, specimen B. But no one sees who you are, so don't worry about it. So the Alter Rebbe said to him, where are you? And the man fainted. Because he said it was such a, you want to know my answer? He gave him his answer. So that's a question we're all asked. What happened was, Adam knew that God could see him. Adam was ashamed. God said, where's your divine image? I created you with a purpose. What did you do with yourself? Where'd you wander off? You completely lost sight of your mission. That's Dayeka, which is a question that we're all asked all the time. Where you are. As I said before, most people, you ask them, who are you? They give you their business card. If you think about it, that's what you do. That's not who you are. As a matter of fact, what you do is probably very far from who you are. Most people, first of all, hate their jobs. Statistics show. Those that like it don't really. They learn to like it because what am I going to do? Just hate everything I do. And very few people end up really doing the job that really reflects, and you could say, this is an expression of my soul. From the moment I was born, what I'm doing today is living up, fulfilling, actualizing my potential. How many people really can say that? It's a great gift if you could. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. But that's the challenge of our lives. We live in a material world, and we forgot, we're made to forget when we're born the entire Torah that we studied in our mother's womb. And our spirituality, or as you can call our soul, our real core selves, is completely concealed. So where are you? It's the most powerful question you can ask a person. You know, you start. It says that an animal will never attack a human being, even a predator, because it sees the divine image on the face of the person, and it respects it. So then, of course, the question is asked, why do we see animals do attack humans? No. The answer is because it doesn't recognize the divine image. It's gone undercover. Daniel, in the lion's den, the lions saw the divine image. They didn't touch him. So it's an interesting take on things. You know, there's going to be a shadow, a veil that doesn't, you can't recognize who you are. There's an expression, Ein Adam Meiz Panav B'fnei Ba'al Cheve. It's somewhat of a joke. It means a person does not have chutzpah, will not, the word chutzpah is? They say, chutzpah is like when someone asks you, how do you say chutzpah in Hebrew? Right, yeah. So that's chutzpah. But chutzpah is also, so no one will have chutzpah. They won't will not have the audacity before someone that did a favor to you. B'fnei Ba'al Cheve, someone give you a loan, someone helped you in your life. So a human being is not going to be, what's the word? Not going to be disrespectful to someone like that. So the question everyone asks is, one second, we see plenty of people, you do favors to them, and then they don't really care, they don't remember, and they stab you in the back. So they give the answer, it says, Ein Adam Meiz Panav. Adam doesn't, that person maybe not, if you're subhuman, of course you could. So if you're a human being, you're not going to do it. So the same thing is here, our humanity can go undercover, the divine image in which we were created. So how do you rediscover it? You need to reconnect to the soul of who you are. Every one of us wanders away from what we began. We started in the Garden of Eden, and then we wander, and we're expelled from it. We lose our innocence, and we're no longer that seamless child where everything just was one flow. Where fruit and peel were one, where hand and glove were one, where inner and outer were one, and so on. And then the whole rest of our lives is, how do you reconnect? And where do you see it play itself out most? In relationships. You see spouses. What are they trying to do? As the Bible puts it, two entities who were once one, separated, and now they're trying to reconnect. And look at all the anguish, and not to mention the trillions of dollars spent on marital therapies and all kinds of forces of relationships, books, everything, you name it. For one thing and one thing only, how can two people who have different ways of looking at something become one? Find harmony, peace. It's in essence, that's the challenge. But you can only if you introduce the soul. As long as self-interest is the reigning power, there's no way two self-interests can last. It can last for a while. You have a contract, and when your self-interest, and we have mutual benefits. But something that's sustainable, that will last forever, requires another ingredient, what we call bittul, where there's an element of beyond my interest and beyond your interest. The chuppah is the hovering element that transcends each individual, so we connect to a cause that's greater than both the sum of the parts. And this is the secret to all forms of unity. The reason it's so difficult is because our own self-interest and our subjective emotional attachment to what we think is right is very hard to break. So, as one person once told me, he hides his ignorance with his arrogance. So what we do is we become trapped in our own arrogance, our own pride and shame, usually due to some insecurity. And the secure person is able to coexist and is able to objectively be accountable, look at themselves, and not always have to blame others. You don't have to be wrong for me to be right. Why do people feel that someone else has to be wrong? Because they're insecure with their position. So if you're right, I can't be right. Just be yourself. As the Alter Rebbe once said, if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am not and you are not. But if I am I because I am I, and you are you because you are you, I am and you are. That's the poetic version of it. In simple English, it means that if your identity is defined by the proximity or by the juxtaposition to someone else, which means you don't know what your identity is. You walk into a room and say, okay, tell me what you guys are like, then I can tell you what my position is, They call them in Yiddish, in Yeshiva, we used to call them ipche mistavriniks. It means the guy says, okay, what's your opinion? He says, no, you tell me your opinion, and then I'll disagree, So they say when they come up to heaven, God will say, so tell me something, a chiddush, an invention in Torah, and they'll say to God, you say something and I'll disagree, So their whole identity is based on this. You tell me what you are, then I know what to be against, that type of thing. There's the Chelam joke. Chelam is one of these towns, the town of the fools. They say there were wise people in Chelam, whatever. But bottom line, it became folklore for all kinds of interesting insights in human nature, quirks. So the guy who has a plenty of identity crisis goes to the mikveh, the ritual bath. And he's getting undressed, he's about to enter and submerge himself in the mikveh, and he has a problem. He says, once I get completely undressed, how will I know who I am when I come out of the mikveh? Because he's identified. Bear with me, it's like a little imaginary type of joke. So he says, how will I know who I am? Because I identify by my clothing. So he has a great idea. He ties a little red thread on his toe. He says, okay, I'll come out, I'll look for the red thread, then I'll know who I am. Okay, he comes out of the mikveh. Unfortunately, as God would have it, as luck would have it, the red thread untied itself and attached to someone else's toe. So he starts looking for this red thread, and he finally finds it. And he goes over to that guy and says, I know who you are, but who am I? So it's but this is sometimes how we look for things. I know you are, but I don't know who I am. When people say, I wish I was you. One of my good friends, Philip, who gives a class tomorrow, I should mention, he tells me when he would tell his grandmother, the little kid, he'd complain, he'd say, I wish I were you. She says, but if you were me, who would be me? We all have our identity. Yeah. So the point of the matter is that we begin with a very unique and defined identity. As some people say, you were born an original, don't become a copy. And at this point, really ask yourself honestly, it's not an easy question to ask yourself. Are you, or are you a product of the forces that shaped you? Your parents' expectations, your community, peer, other social pressures, what you convince yourself people are expecting, which may not even be real. It's very hard to even know. Because if you've grown up with all those pressures and all those forces and voices, then what are you like if you did not have all those factors involved? So we have clearly plenty work to do to realign ourselves. And this requires some courage, and sometimes it requires actually breaking away. Abraham, because to find yourself, you need to be out of the shadow of forces that have shaped you. That doesn't mean they're bad forces. They could be beautiful forces, but it still doesn't tell you who you are. The Baal Shem Tov has an unbelievable line. Baal Shem Tov was the great teacher of the Maggid of Mezritch, who was the great teacher of the Baal HaTanya. And it's also his yahrzeit, by the way. The Maggid of Mezritch's yahrzeit is also Yutes Kislev tonight. The Baal Shem Tov asks, we say every day in Shemoneh Esrei, in the Amidah, in the davening, Elokeinu v'Elokei Avosenu Elokei Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov. My God, the God of my parents, Elokeinu, your God, the God of your parents, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he asks, the chronological order should have been reversed. First, it was God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Elokei Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. Then Elokei Avosenu, God of our parents, and then Elokeinu, your God. Elokeinu, our God. And the answer is simple but profound. This is the essence of Hasidic thought, the Ayeka. He says that in the educational process, obviously children need to be taught values by their parents. The parents do their best to convey what they feel is the right thing to teach children. So then that comes first. But once you grow into an adult, Zeh Keli Vanveu, Keli, God has to become your God. You have to own the God. You can't be worshiping the God of your parents, because then it's just a cultural thing. Then it's just a traditional thing. You have to own your God. It has to become a personal God to you. And then you add, it's Elokei Avosenu, it's also the God of my parents, and the God of my grandparents, and all the way to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That ownership is only possible if you have soul introspection. If you think about things, if you study it, Many people are afraid to do that because you know what? I don't want to rock the boat. I received what I received. Why do I have to challenge it? I don't know the word challenge is necessary. Some of us need the word challenge, need to challenge, but the point is not about challenge. The point is being mature. And if you don't have a mature Judaism, what are the chances that your children are going to have a mature Judaism? And so it's about learning to embrace and connect the soul to the body. That's what it's about. Tefillah b'lei kavana, prayer without soul, without intention, is like a body without a soul. We call that belaz, we call that a corpse. A soul without a body is equally problematic because it's not grounded and concretized in this world. So we can talk about this at length, and this is so much part of my life, what I grew up around, the soulful teachings of Hasidic thought, the songs, the Balatanya, the Bala Geula of today was a major composer as well, because it all goes together, song, soul, spirit. But the bottom line is it's a Rosh Hashanah of a day, a Chassidus, of fusing body and soul, which is the essence of all revolutions taking place today. Whether scientists and Apple or Google know it or not, doesn't make a difference. But the essence of what they're doing is trying to find the unified field theory, the Hashem Echad, the God particle in everything. Because that's the connector that connects our lives. And on a personal level, it means, it's true, technology, communications are connecting us like never before. As I said before, you could be right here, access to anything, anytime, anywhere. Right? And it's all joining together. The technologies of visual to TV, the technology of computing, and the technology of the telephone, communications, all becoming one, has become one already. But the final frontier is the unity that it does in our own personal lives. As I mentioned before, Bertrand Russell versus Maimonides. The unity of defining who are you, Ayeko, who are you? And the rest follows that. Not your actions define who you are. It's who you are that should define your actions. In other words, your soul should be telling your body where to go, not your body should be telling your soul where to go. Because that would be the equivalent of having a very sophisticated tool chest, and your hammers and screwdrivers and wrenches and all the other tools are telling your hand what to do. How would that make sense? So we have an array, we have a wide variety, we have a wide array of tools in our lives. But tools are, like I said, klippas. They're shells. They're protective veils. The material world is simply a tool for some type of spiritual expression. And that is the essence of what our lives are like. When you get to know that, then your whole life falls into place. As long as you continue to worship the peel and think that the glove is more important than the hand, or as the cynics on Madison Avenue say, it's more important what people think happened than what actually happened, where perception is more important than reality, then you live a life, a blind life, an empty life, which, you can convince yourself you're happy on that shell level, but you've never seen the fruit within. So, on this special day of Yutas Kislev, 216 years from the liberation, and dedicated, as I said, to Malkavas, may we all use the energies that are, what's the word I want to say, that are reverberating today, and allow it to channel into our lives, be a more soulful day, a more soulful experience, and ultimately discover what our soul's purpose is about. And as uncomfortable as it may be, it's hard to stand in the mirror and say, who am I? Mirror, mirror on the wall type of thing. But if you surround yourself with people that are who are thoughtful, and are not seduced by the superficiality of life, then usually these questions come up more than often than not, and you'll be compelled to answer that question, who you are as opposed to what you do. And Shalas Chacham Chetz Tshuva, the question of a wise person is half an answer. If you ask the right question, you're halfway there. So God should bless everybody to be able to ask those right questions and to look at ourselves and look at the people around us. At the end of the day, step back and think of the big picture, not your comfort zone and what makes you comfortable, but why were you sent here? The Alter Rebbe, to conclude, someone once came to see him, and he had a grocery list of needs, blessings for this and blessings for that. And after he finished reading the whole list of what he needed, the Alter Rebbe looked at him and said, okay, this is what you need. And what are you needed for? That you didn't write. So there's things we need and things where we are needed for. We were sent here not to fill our needs, we're here to do something, to accomplish something. As a part of the process is to get our needs met. But if a life is driven just by getting your needs met, you're missing the ayek, or the mission of who you are. So I say to everyone, good yontif to everyone. Like I say, Rosh Hashanah, Lashon HaTeva Tekaseva, they say, B'teres Hasidus, B'limud Hasidus, Darkei Hasidus, and we will be here next Wednesday, continuing this journey. Next week will be Hanukkah, so it's also the festival of light. Light is essentially soul compared to the wick. Olive oil is inner energy. You look at an olive, you don't see what's inside it until you press it. So all this is significant, and it says in the books that olive oil is representative of Rozei Daraisa, the secrets of the Torah. Wine is compared to the secrets, and then there's the secrets of the secrets. So that we'll talk about next week more in detail, if you want to know the secrets of the secrets. That's if you've mastered the secrets, there's always another level. And so may it be a month, a week, a life of light. Light, little light dispels great darkness, and the world should experience finally its liberation and redemption of a world that, as Maimonides puts it, that the main primary work of the world will be not materialism as an end in itself, but to know God. A world filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea, as Isaiah the prophet prophesied so many years ago. So the real information age, the real information revolution, is that information. The knowledge, Eitz Hadas, to know, but to know God as the waters cover the sea. Everyone have a very blessed week. Thank you.